For more on the protest and the future of police reforms is Bunny Welsh, a former Pennsylvania sheriff and the current vice president of the National Sheriff's Association. She also serves as a Women for Trump advisory board member. So, Bunny, when we look at what's going on in Seattle right now, there's not a lot that I can really compare this to. Sometimes the past is the future with the lights on, but on this situation, I don't know exactly what comes next. So now that the mayor is saying that they do want to kind of break up this zone, retake that precinct, are they looking at a complicated situation?
Well, they certainly are, because my understanding from the information I've received is that there are people with arms inside this area, inside this zone. And if they are armed and they are willing and able to use those arms to protect that zone, it could be a very, very difficult and dangerous situation for anybody trying to enter the zone. I understand law enforcement has already been not only rebuffed, but challenged when they tried to get in this weekend for a shooting.
You're exactly right. I mean, this past weekend we saw shootings, and we had some reporters on the ground the weekend prior, and they're walking around with open firearms. And it's, of course, not illegal to do so, but it does complicate that situation, assuming that they do have the proper paperwork and all of that. But now that they have kind of allowed this situation to fester a little bit for several weeks now, instead of necessarily just nipping it in the bud when it was very early on, did they complicate the situation even more so by allowing these individuals to kind of camp out and kind of make their own community a little bit longer?
Yeah, in my opinion, they did. And if you recall in the beginning, the mayor said something about it would be a summer of love, which I found absolutely preposterous. This is not a street party. This is not a festival. This is a group of people who have determined to unlawfully take over property that isn't theirs and set up their own sort of enforcement or encampment. And my understanding is that they really don't want law enforcement there. They want to provide their own law enforcement. And what is concerning about this is this kind of thing can be replicated anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
And it's happening in Seattle. There was a tremendous attempt last night to put something together in Washington, D.C. But this kind of takeover by hostile groups, by anarchy, in my opinion, and absolute chaos, it could be replicated, and it should have been stopped very early. It could have been stopped very early.
In fact, we saw the same thing happen in Nashville as well as Portland, and actually mayors there did take action early on, and you haven't heard too much about it since then. But when it comes to the Seattle mayor as well, I think it's an important lesson to bring up that in the political climate we live in, there are some people who are so adamant about being anti-Trump that they defend the most ridiculous positions. I mean, the summer of love comment that you were talking about, the idea that this autonomous zone was the idea of democracy when really it's a bunch of vigilantes taking over a part of a major city. I mean, that's a pretty ridiculous position to defend. And now this mayor is put in a situation where she has to walk back those comments or else look like a hypocrite. So another issue that comes back to is police, the language used against police. Some people are taking very violent language against police. Do you think that this is something that is more widespread throughout the nation, where we're seeing a little bit of a more anti-cop sentiment?
I think it has really damaged the morale of the police. The two separate, what triggered this first was the killing of George Floyd.
Right.
Everybody was horrified by that. Law enforcement and citizens alike. It was an unjustified, it was a horrible thing to see. Now, the recent killing of Mr. Brooks in Atlanta was an entirely different circumstance.
Right.
And I'm tired of hearing these things characterized. Mr. Brooks was just driving through a drive-through, fast food, and he was killed. That isn't at all what happened. It was a set of circumstances that was cordial at first, professional at first, until they went to take Mr. Brooks into custody.
Right.
Then it turned into a ground fight, a very vicious ground fight, where Mr. Brooks stole a taser, which is a lethal weapon. Mr. Brooks injured one of the officers, and then he ran away and turned around and fired a lethal weapon at an officer. He was met with deadly force. Yeah. Lethal weapon for lethal weapon. But look what has happened now. That prosecutor, Mr. Howard, has charged him with felony murder. Felony murder. That's punishable by life in prison or possibly death.
Yeah.
How does that affect the morale, not only in Atlanta, but all over the nation, of men and women who put on a badge every day, go out to protect and serve, actually act according to their training He was within his training, and I've watched those tapes over and over again. And this prosecutor didn't even wait till the GBI came out with their
Right.
investigation before he charged. And how does that make the men and women who go out every day want to respond? How do they feel about no backup? How do they feel about the vilification of police? And that's not just Atlanta, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's very sad.
No, and I think that is what you're speaking to is a little bit of a politicization of this issue as well. I mean, I don't want to speculate too much, but this district attorney is in a election year. He's not very popular in that area as well, and a lot of people are saying that maybe he did overcharge these officers in order to gain some more support ahead of his election. And I think what you're speaking of is something that is true all across the country. I mean, even in Minneapolis as well, I mean, they did have initial charges, and then those charges were bumped up a little bit, kind of casting a cloud of what it will end up. Second-degree murder, of course, is different than manslaughter. So it'll be interesting to see really how these legal systems respond to this, because, I mean, if we don't, for example, get justice in the court system, we're going to see more protests when we finally get the decision down. But Bunny Welsh, I appreciate you coming on tonight, breaking down the idea of police reforms. Thank you.